the book to the Romans, the foundation of our faith, and this is session number 3. We have worked partway through chapter 2, and we're picking up at verse 28, and we will join Paul the Apostle's thought process, and we will go as quickly as we can to cover this very important material. He mentions the truly righteous, or what he has termed in other places, the true Jew. The true Jew. We will reflect back to a previously written epistle from the Apostle Paul in Galatians chapter 3, where he tells us, be advised to follow your father Abraham. This is the explanation in Galatians chapter 3, and he comes up with a powerful illustration dealing with Abraham becoming a true Jew. He was not born a true Jew. He was not born naturally a Jew. He lived before the law of Moses. He was a Gentile. He resided in the city of Ur, in the land of the Chaldees, and he was judged righteous by God because of his faith. This is an absolute breakthrough illustration for Paul to use, dealing with a Gentile that can become righteous before God, somewhat unheard of in some sections. A Gentile can be righteous before God without obeying the law of Moses. Now that is a tidal wave in some areas as well, and a Gentile can be righteous before God without becoming or converting to be a Jew first. Because that was one of the other first century responses to this dilemma. Well, those of you that are outside the ark of safety, that would be all the Gentiles, the dogs as they called them then and now, you have to convert, stand in this number 2 wash tub, kind of, and be baptized into this faith and this family. Paul's saying you don't have to do that. You can if you want to, but it doesn't get you any extra credit toward anything. It just makes you feel better about yourself. How can this happen? Well, in verses 7, 8, and 9, and again in Galatians chapter 3, by sharing in Abraham's faith in God. That is the key that Paul gives to us, and this should be material that should be rejoicing by every Gentile that has ever heard this combination of information. All that have faith in God as Abraham did, he says, are the real children of Abraham, the real sons, the real daughters of Abraham, the true Jew, according to the Apostle Paul and his terminology and the way he defines it. However, Jesus taught and concurred with this position. It's recorded in a very brief encounter in John chapter 8, specifically verse 39, a revealing conversation about Abraham. As Jesus was teaching, the Pharisees come to him in that, and of course they do it in public, they do it with great pride, they do it to show him up as a teacher of the law, and they say with their chest out and their chin up, we have Abraham as our father. And you know what the implication is. And you don't. We do. We have Abraham as our father, and we up here, in this select circle, this little elite clique that we have fashioned for ourselves, Jesus responded, I'm not sure they got it, but he uses the word if. If you were Abraham's children, if. So he's casting doubt on their claim already in the first phrase. If you were Abraham's children, you would be doing the work of Abraham. And obviously they were not. At first, children are identified by with their parents with similar appearance, but as they mature, it's not so much appearance, but it's the behavior and the character that becomes the identifier. And I think in a maybe not so tight way, but a loose way, that's very much ours as well. We may look similar, but later the character and the identifying traits of who we are begin to show who we really are. Here's the phrase that's borrowed from the Old Testament prophet Habakkuk. The just, or the righteous, shall live by faith. Wow. Now that's a bombshell. That's a big statement from an Old Testament prophet, and the original quotation is from Habakkuk 2:4, but it's also quoted in Romans 1:17 and also in Hebrews 10:38. So we have a double quotation there, but the spiritual truth and concept is so important of a statement that we actually possess in the canon of the New Testament 3 complete books that explain that statement. These 3 books are dedicated to explaining that statement and the background and the meaning and the impact to us. The just, and this is from the book of Romans, as Paul is defining what just or what righteous is. What is a righteous person? Then in the book of Galatians, he explains how we live, how we shall live, and living out this identity, living out this position, living out this prosperity of spirituality. And then in the book of Hebrews, we have the illustration at length by faith. Just people, righteous people live by faith, not by sight. So let's go back to Romans 2, and we've got in verse 29, how is this circumcision of heart, which is Paul's reference now, accomplished? Well, of course, it's by the Spirit and not by the letter, or, of course, not by any kind of physical handiwork at all. The circumcision deals not only with the sign that the covenant is in order and is active, but it applies to people of all ages, and it applies to all genders. Because this is not a physical thing that was signified in the Old Testament. The true Jew has an inward condition of the heart that has been changed. I'll call it spiritual surgery by the Holy Spirit. You can't do this by yourself. Your elders at your church cannot do this. You can't perform this. This is only in the Spirit, by the Spirit, in your internal heart. Knowing the will of God is not enough. We must obey and do His will also. In fact, if we only do know the will of God and fail to do it, it becomes a burden and a condemnation to us. And Jesus promised not to give us any more revelation of truth until we obeyed and followed what we already possessed. In order, see, this, it sounds mean on the surface, but it's not. It's very kind and loving in that He doesn't want to increase your burden of responsibility for instruction and therefore the responding obedience. If you're not going to follow what you've already received, you don't get any more because it's going to overburden you. And you see it from a whole different perspective coming from the heart of love. The major problem that we have here, both in the first century and in today's church as well, is that the outward stuff of behavior and demonstration gains the approval and the praise of men. Men see it. They see that we're living a Christian lifestyle and give us credit for that. And we kind of begin to prime the pump on that as they begin giving us credit for that, we keep feeding the machine even more. And we're headed in the wrong direction when we do that. The inward stuff, the things of the heart, of relationships and of worship, gains the approval of God Himself. He actually praises those who will, with a dedicated heart, put their priorities correct and worship Him in that duality that He explained in John chapter 3, in spirit and in truth. You probably have been to groups or churches where they worship in the Spirit, but they go fantastical. I'll make up a word. They just go off the deep end. They have no basis in truth or revealed reality. There are others that are stuck completely because they have a Holy Spirit prejudice. They're stuck in the Bible and the Scriptures themselves. They worship in the truth, but they never visit the Spirit. This is not as easy as it sounds, because you must be in both realms simultaneously. It's a subset. It's not just spirit some of the time. It's not just truth some of the time. It's both all of the time. And it will challenge every fiber of your being to make sure that you're in one without leaving the other one. And so that's just a word to the wise in these days. Which one do you think is more popular with people today? The praise of men or the praise of God? Well, that's an obvious answer, is it not? Here's the beginning of the good news. First, we all stand before God in initially the same condition. We'll get to this. There's good news and there's bad news, and to understand and accept the good news, you've got to acknowledge the bad news first. But here's some of the good news. And in Romans 3:1, what advantage does the Jew have is the question that comes up. If that is true, Paul, that we all are in the same condition, then I thought the Jew had an advantage. What advantage do they have? Well, the faithful and just God is the title of this particular section of Scripture. First of all, and that's a phrase from the New International Version, and Paul will give more reasons later in another chapter in Romans, but the first and primary reason of the Jewish nation, given responsibility and privilege, that they have received the communication from God first. There's just no way around that. They were selected, they were picked, they were favored. What they and we now as true Jews, as Paul has given us this definition that is inclusive to us as well as Gentile believers, it's what we do with that communication that is very crucial, very important. So verse 3, we're looking at kind of the dark side or the flip side of this. Do I have any power in unbelief? You see, there are those that think that everything comes in twos, everything is dual, but there is power in faith believing. But do you have power in unbelief? Some, just trying to be fair and equal, would say, oh, of course. But no, we really don't. A popular theory is if I do not accept or believe in God, then he has no effect. Then he has no son. Then there is no message called the gospel. He's not the one speaking to my heart, because I do not believe, he simply ceases to exist. And in their world, that's a true statement. They don't accept him, except there's no power in that unbelief that they have erased him from their world, but he's still there. They are only wanting and wishing and hoping they could erase God from their world, but the power of their unbelief is nil. It's just nothing. Romans 3:4 has as a phrase, no way, Paul says. May it never be, or God forbid. This is a common idiom in first century Hebrew. God is the just and faithful one, even if every person fails. He is still the faithful and the true one. May it never be even thought of that there would be something that you could have power in your unbelief to literally undo the things that God has done or make God completely go away. Paul is responding to Jewish critics in Rome in verses 5 through 8. They were stating these things. First, that Paul was afraid to come to Rome and present the gospel of Jesus Christ there. I'm not sure what their reasoning might be. It was kind of a dangerous place. He could get arrested, or at least it would reflect upon his citizenship. Second, Paul is now reported to be teaching that the end justifies the means. That's what they're accusing him of. This is something that we have to do in biblical study in reverse engineering. Paul is giving the response and the answer, and we have to figure out what the question is, or the condition is, or what he's dealing with. And he is accused of this fallacy that's been taught certainly in political arenas for centuries and in theological schools for the last 100 years or so. That the end justifies the means, and the theology of the argument develops this way on our side. That the grace of God comes upon sin. True. Sin is necessary for grace to be imparted. True. Therefore, here's the untrue part. Sin is good in that it brings about a higher good. You may remember Rasputin, the spiritual advisor, kind of a self-made Russian Orthodox priest who was a spiritual advisor to the last of the czars of Russia. And he spoke of the sweetness of the grace because of abundant sin, and came out and said it. Therefore, we need to be sinning more so that grace can come more. And he's absolutely, completely wrong. And he's after this argument that the end justifies the means. Paul takes this teaching he's reported to support, and does not, to its logical conclusion. When you take things all the way out, this is really a good practice to do, both politically and theologically. Something doesn't smell right, doesn't feel right, doesn't seem right. Take the logic of that theology and take it as far as it will go. Just keep working it until you reach the point of silliness. Then you know what you're dealing with. Run it out to see if this is God's plan. And in this case, it's not. Paul says this is the total absurdity of that kind of logic or position, and he says he does not even need to debate such a point, but concludes with this thought, that those who teach this deserve their punishment. It's so wrong, I'm not even going to argue with you about it. But if you're teaching this, and you're accusing me of teaching it, you deserve your punishment. You're going to deserve what you get, and it's not going to be pretty. In verses 9 through 12, we're still in Romans chapter 3, there is a conclusion from Paul, and he uses the word, and this all-sweeping term, all. There I use the word to use the word. He says, there's not a group without excuse for their wrongdoing. You know there's a difference between a reason and an excuse. A reason usually has a pretty good ground to stand on, or at least some point. An excuse is just something you made up, and the only person in the world that believes it is the person in the mirror. Because you only have to convince one person. That's how good your excuse has to be. You don't have to have the masses convinced. You don't have to have 51% convinced. You only need to convince one person, and that's you. And you don't really have to have a very good, lame excuse as long as you go along with it. And we see that happens all the time. The key is no group, no individual is able to come to a stage of righteousness before God because of their system of beliefs or strict moral code. Even those that have none, those that have some, and those that have a lot of those things, those morals and those codes and conduct. He says we're all guilty. No matter what you fashion for yourself. Oh, I've made up my own religion. I have my own way of worship. Well, you've violated your own rules, my friend. If you'll examine it honestly, you just look in the mirror and go, did you do what you set for yourself as boundaries? Yep. I went over my own rules, and then I goofed them up. Verses 13 through 18 describe the behavior and the characteristics of all people as a confirmation of this previous conclusion. He quotes from the Old Testament in Psalm chapter 10, Isaiah 59, and in Psalm 36. So let me ask this question, just from the sideline. I'm like heckling myself, I think, Pastor.
Okay.
All right? Is there any excuse for non-Christian behavior? How about from Christian believers? Is there an excuse? Not really. We might understand an extenuating circumstance and your reasoning, but really no. The answer is no. How about from non-Christians? Is there any excuse for your non-Christian employees to steal from the office supply room? Or from inventory? Or from petty cash box? Can you imagine an atheist being just completely honest during his employment application interview, saying, now look, I don't believe there's a God, and so as a result I'm going to be falsifying my time cards, I'm going to be stealing from inventory and selling it out the back door, pocketing the money, I'm going to take my own office supplies from the supply we have here because I don't believe there's a God. And go, no, we can't use you here. Why? That even as an atheist, we expect Christian behavior. We expect honesty from non-Christians. You know what they tell me? I'm only human.
Right.
Really? You mean the implication that there is something fundamentally wrong with the way that God has created you? That your behavior is naturally flawed just because you're human? There's an additional implication for the Christian believers of giving this excuse. You've accepted God's grace for your life. The Holy Spirit has done His best work to repair and restore you, and you're still critically flawed. God has done His best work, and you're still messed up. And admit it. Not only admit it, you use it for an excuse of bad behavior. Maybe you've been in counseling situations, group or private, and here comes a phrase that says something like, but he's really got a good heart. And I'm telling you, 99.9% of the time, the next statement is the description of his bad behavior. As if you have a good heart, then we're supposed to understand your bad behavior and give you a pass. Furthermore, this I'm only human thing, let me share with you this. I believe we are the closest thing in all creation to God Himself. We are higher than the elements. We are higher than the fish. We are higher than the birds. We are higher than the warm-blooded mammals that may be very close in DNA to us, but they're not there. We're higher than the angels. They are created beings that don't have the will and the choice that you and I do to serve God out of our desire for fellowship and response to His declared love for us. They do what they're told to do. We are a higher being created almost to a godlike level. And for us, of all things on the face of the earth, to say, I'm only human, what a diminishing of the entire creation. If you're only, and I hate that word, only human, you are human. You have a choice. You have a will. You have sensitivity to the Holy Spirit and what He tells you, what He moves on you to do or to not do. Only human. Let me tell you, it's human beings that Jesus Christ died for. We are worth, in God's estimation, the pearl of great price, to be sacrificed, No higher cost could have been given. Jesus thinks that we flawed human beings, are worth saving. And he didn't just talk about it. He didn't just give us a good line about it. He did something in demonstration about it. I love you is his statement. And he paid the ultimate price. A brief outline of review just so far in Romans. Verses 1:1 through 1:17 are just an introduction. A good introduction, but that the material begins at verse 18. 1:18 through 3:20 gives us what we will label the need of salvation. I don't mean to belittle evangelists or preachers of any sort, but we are salesmen. And one of the keys in sales is that you determine the need of your client. You find out what they need, and then a normal fleshly salesman would fill the need. They need a new copier in their office. You provide the copier, and you arrange the financing and the toner and the delivery and all that. But you find out the need. Here we have Paul stating the need of salvation in every single person on this earth. They have this need, and we have, in essence, the product. We are to bring it to them. As you see in the next section from 3:21 to 5:21, we now have what's called the way of salvation. This is how the mechanics of salvation are dispersed and dispensed and given to an individual. In verses 19 and 20, we see that the law of Moses has some power, but the power is in diagnosis. It can determine sin, but it cannot cure it. There's no cure of sin following the law of Moses in its entirety. Now, he says in verse 19, the law of Moses speaks to those that are under the law. Now, Paul has in his course has broadened the definition of the law, and he's not just including the law of Moses, but also more than the law of Moses into what we call natural law. Things that are of obvious truth that God has revealed. God has given a revelation of himself to every man, and that revelation, no matter how great, no matter how detailed or small or indirect, must be responded to, accepted, and obeyed. If he has just spoken to, the proverbial isolated man on the desert island, if he only spoke through the elements of nature to that man, he spoke. He revealed something about himself to this person, and God expects a response. Let's commensurate with that which you have been revealed. The more you've been revealed, the more response is your responsibility. The more you know, the more he shows you. To whom does this law speak? This broadened definition of law from Paul. Does it speak to the pagans? Yeah. Does it speak to the heathen? Clearly. Does it speak to the barbarians? Absolutely. They have a sensitivity, each and every single one. No matter how dull it may be in some cases, they have a sensitivity to the revelation of God, and they are capable of receiving it. God has also revealed himself to the self-righteous man, the moral man. That's another term for the same category. And he's also revealed himself to the religious man, the Jew. He's at the top of the heap, so to speak. But why is it necessary to make this point? Because Paul is putting all three of these great categories into one lump sum. Every single person has failed. Every single person has failed. So reason number one. And this one is a little bit fun. Maybe for me. We'll see if it's fun for you. That every mouth be closed. This is not shut up and sit down. That's not what this means. It means that every excuse, every position of opposition be silenced. You have no more to say. You've been silenced. How about I did not know? Closed. How about I did not accept? Closed. How about I don't have a Bible? Closed. How about I don't have any faith? Closed. How about I do not understand? Closed. I can't read the Bible without falling asleep. Closed. I refuse to believe in your God. Closed. Every one of those mouths are now closed by the 3 chapters that we have reviewed. The proper presentation of this truth to the letter of Romans will shut every mouth of excuse and every mouth of opposition in the world, in the entire world. An individual still retains the choice to reject God's revelation of salvation. Absolutely. This revelation only comes through the Son, Jesus Christ, but every reason, that is, every position that is reasonable and everything that would be called a sane objection used to reject him and his offer of salvation through Jesus Christ is now closed and removed. Now, the only cause left to reject Jesus Christ cannot be called a reason, because it is totally unreasonable to reject him. You can't use the word reason anymore. And the only thing left, taken to the extreme now, we do have a word for that choice and that situation, and it is called insanity. One of the things I must connect from these 3 chapters to 2 Thessalonians, there is a terrible condition that is described by Paul where God sends a delusion that they would believe a lie. Excuse me, the lie. How can we understand these? Well, I hate to even get into categories. This world today, with people that are rejecting, they've believed a lie. In this case, it's the lie that I believe came from the Garden of Eden. You shall be as gods. And once they are given that delusion and they believe the lie, they can reject this wonderful offer of God through Jesus Christ, but it is still insanity because it is outside the boundaries and the definitions of reason. It's amazing. Either what God has delivered you from or God has prevented you from being deluded and believing the lie and having to struggle to come back from that even with his help. I think you've probably been inoculated. You've been prevented. You have not fallen for this wile of the enemy and still retain the ability to accept Jesus Christ and the offer that God has through him. Reason number 2, each individual is accountable. All over the world, every country, every culture, every people group, every language, every single person, no matter their gender, perceived or real, no matter their age, lied or real, is accountable for your action. They're not accountable to me. I'm not the policeman for the world. I haven't been appointed or self-appointed, the Canadian Royal Mountie that is on assignment to straighten out and police the whole world, all their bad language and all their bad literature and all their bad movies. I'm not the cop. I'm responsible for me, not for you. I'm responsible to God, accountable to Him, and so are you for you. You must take accountability and credit for what you do. But, Mark, I wasn't potty trained correctly, and my whole life has been messed up. Well, maybe so. My mother warped me at 2 years old. Maybe so. But since you knew, I wonder, this is facetious, of course, I wonder who crept into your house when you weren't looking and taught your children how to lie. Because they learned it and they lied. At some point, and it's pretty early on, I'm not convinced of this age 12 age of accountability thing. Pretty early on, I didn't do it. No, Mommy, I didn't do it. Yes, you did. I saw you do it. I didn't do it. Wow, isn't that amazing? They know the truth. And they choose to lie. They choose to lie. It's sad, but it's amazing. So verse 320 has another thing in it here. He uses the word because. And he reflects a background. The works of the law of Moses, the good deeds done for the benefit of others, can never justify an individual before God. James says you can't obey the whole law. But if you could, let's just theorize. If you could obey the whole law of Moses, now that would be a full-time job. You won't be able to hold any kind of a secular position. I don't know who's going to pay your bills, but following the law of Moses is a full-time job because of the interpretation and the application. But if you could do it, let's just say you're the first one that breaks through. You're still not justified before God. Isn't that amazing? What then is the benefit of the law at all? That's a fair question. And you understand that I switch my hats between prosecuting attorney and defense attorney. I pop back and forth across the venue before the impartial jury, I trust, asking the questions from this side and from that side. What is the benefit of the law of Moses at all? It gives us a moral compass. It defines what is right and what is wrong. Sin is defined in the law of Moses. We know some things about God, principles that are expressed. Paul, I think, used this phrase, that the goodness of the law remains. Not the condemnation, and not the animal sacrifices, and not the incessant study and lifestyle, but those things that are kind of somewhat intangible at times are good for us. Phillips' translation of this passage says this: it is the straight edge of the law that shows us how crooked we are. So he's not advocating that we convert back and go be Jews. He's just saying, here's something good in the law of Moses, that it shows us up. And that's a good thing. Those without the written law of Moses, those with good deeds and with good morals, and those that have received God's revelation in its fullness, every one of those people has committed sin through willfulness, rebellion, and not through ignorance. Even at 2, we know that's a lie. That's not true. Now, we don't get the implication of that. We don't learn the philosophy of it. But we know there's something that's wrong. Share your toys. No. We know disobedience. We know rebellion against authority and many other things. Even the most religious, the Jews, possessed correct, absolutely, minutely correct moral knowledge, and yet they chose evil deeds and bad behavior. It's absolutely amazing. And as you study through Kings and Chronicles and the times of the prophets, you'll see this 7-step cycle, sometimes it's 5, that goes right back around. God retrieves people, He redeems them, He restores them, they become lazy again, they fall into idol worship, and there we go around the circle over and over again. Same people, same idiots. And you know, we do the same thing. We can until we see that and break that terrible cycle of settling after revival and then getting lackadaisical again. Important points to establish in our belief. 1, it is I who has sinned. It's not my mommy's fault. Not the rejection, not the poverty, not being forced to go to church. It's my responsibility for my willfulness. Whether I resisted the revelation of God through creation and the many signs around me, or if I violated the ideal moral code that I accepted, or one that I created for myself, even then, or as part of a religious group along the way that possessed clear revelation and understanding of the will of God, it remains me. I am the one who has sinned. And I stand guilty for that sinful behavior before God. I'm not responsible for the sins of others. Don't go there. I'm telling you, you don't share in that. And there's all kinds of problems theologically when you're responsible for the sins of other people. And you know, other people are not held accountable for the choices of my action either. I may affect them, that part is there, but they're not accountable. Paul's major conclusion is all are guilty. The barbarian, the pagan, and the heathen, guilty. The good ethics and good morals people, guilty. The religious and the knowledgeable group that have heard the discernment of the Holy Spirit and chose a different way, guilty. Each person in every culture and in every people group have been given a revelation of God according to Paul, and they have made a choice as to whether to seek and obey that revelation and truth revealed or to reject it. And that's the basis. This is a masterful legal presentation that Paul makes that no one has been able to effectively refute in 2,000 years. This is a gorgeous document between the brain of Paul and the Spirit of the living God. And what a combination those two have together. I want to pick somebody from a culture that I've dealt with many times. I've been 12 trips into Russia, and so I'm picking a Russian for personal reasons, but also because of who this man is. Ivan Turgenev. He's a Russian author. He's a famous atheist. He is a rationalist from the 1800s. Listen to what he says. Now, he's a bad man. Are you with me? Not because he's Russian, but because of the choices of philosophy and religion and morals that he has made in his own life. He says this, and I quote, "I do not know what the heart of a bad man is like, but I do know what the heart of a good man is like, and it is terrible." How can you say that, Mark? Saul of Tarsus, a good, moral, religious, faithful to the ultimate. And you know what God did? He saved him out of that good religious life.
Yes.
He wasn't a bad man. He wasn't an abuser. He wasn't a criminal. He didn't kill anybody personally. He didn't abuse his wife. He was a good man. And God says, you need salvation. Now that kind of breaks the crockery for some people, that Paul is a good man and needed to be saved from that. You need to be saved from religion. and get all that junk out of your life. All of it. Paul continues from this conclusion in 3:20, contains two important statements for it. Verse 3, chapter 20 is just amazing. Full obedience and strict compliance to the law of Moses will not bring the approval of God. That's rough. It is the law of Moses that brings sin to light and teaches us that we have sinned. If I had my little sign tonight, I'd put it over here on the wall. That sign would say wet paint. And you know what? There's this many here tonight. You know what's going to happen? Somebody's going to go over there and touch it. Now, if there's no sign, you won't give it another thought. That's what the law does. It brings sin to light. And it even makes it attractive in a weird, backwards kind of a way. Paul gives us now 4 special terms, theological terms, in the next few verses. And these are important to us. It's important that we accept them. And they will bring clarification, a great deal of that, and understanding concerning what I'm going to call the mechanics of salvation, how this thing actually works. Justification is used in Romans 3, 24, 26, 28, I think it's on your page. In justification, God legally announces in the Supreme Court of Heaven that this man, this woman who was a sinner is now deemed and considered to be righteous because he conforms to the demand of the character of God. Literally, he's now clothed in the righteousness of Jesus Christ. It's a legal thing. You are moved categorically in justification. It doesn't mean that everything under the robe of righteousness of Jesus Christ that's upon you is tidy white. But it means you're covered. And your status has changed. The second term is redemption. A familiar term, but also in verse 24, 324, this offering of Christ has come in and made an offer to buy back the slave to sin. To the common observer, it looks like the ruined slave. The slave that has botched up life, messed up completely. And he brings the ransom in redemption. This is truly our own personal exodus from Egypt, the land of slavery and bondage on a personal level. And that is a wonderful type of the Old Testament that just pays off with lots of fruit through our study of types. This is deliverance from the sin penalty that's under the law of Moses. There's a penalty for sin. It gives us deliverance from sin as a power over us as a master. It also delivers us from the bondage relationship to Satan, to Pharaoh. We no longer have that relationship, and we are released to a new life of true freedom and liberty in God, serving Him. Propitiation, not a word that came up in your conversation this week, but a very good term theologically. Verse 25, most simply put, it is substitution. Here's the wonderful provision of the mercy of God in exhibition, that He still demands blood for sin, but He will permit a substitute sacrifice. If you can get any of your friends to step up and pay your price, because your life is due. Check your list of people that would lend you some bail money. There is a few. All right? Now, let's shorten that list. Who would give you bail money as a gift? Now, here's the ultimate short list. Who would step into the jail cell and serve your time and pay your fine and let you go free. There's only one name on that short list, and it's Jesus Christ, the one who loves you more than your mother. He is the only one that will do this propitiation for you. But God permits it. Aren't you glad for that part of the mercy of God? Remission is in verse 25. This is a cancel or a pardon only made possible by the blood sacrifice of Jesus Christ. For more detailed information, see Leviticus 1 through 16, all 16 chapters, and also chapter 9 of the book of Hebrews. There are 10 occurrences of the word remission in the New Testament, and as expected, remission is always used with the word sins, never without. It's remission of sins. It's the cancel. It's the pardon that God has fashioned for sins. Now, you look at these four and you go, these kind of seem contradictory. Let me assure you they are not. On further study, you'll see they work together in great harmony as the team that explains and expands our knowledge of salvation and how it actually works. Verses 21 to 24, the righteousness of God, Paul starts with the words, but now. It's a transition point. It's kind of a connective tissue. We have read of sin, we've read of guilt, we've read of rejection of the revelation of God through Jesus Christ, but now we will read some of the sweetest words in all of Scripture. But now all are guilty before God, none is righteous in motive or deed, all mouths are shut regarding any self-defense. But now Paul turns the focus 180 degrees and gives an astounding piece of revelation, and he says this: there is a righteousness from God that is available to men from outside the law of Moses. Got any interested takers? It sounds like almost too good of a deal to be true. God has made a way. He has made a way for a man, a sinful man, a guilty man, to be made right and to be made holy before a just God. This is amazing. This is the biggest. This is bit by bit, detail by detail. We are describing the greatest miracle that ever happens on the face of this earth. To a human being. You can put all the healing stuff in a can. This is the big miracle in your life. Yes. Don't forget that. The way to get right with God and be right with God through believing in Jesus Christ is depending upon His fullness, His faithfulness to satisfy the demands that God has concerning sin. He hasn't changed the definition of sin. He hasn't lightened the penalty whatsoever. But He has made a way. It's amazing that He has made any way at all for us to be reclaimed, to be restored, to come back to essentially the Garden of Eden. To come back in full restoration of fellowship with God. There will be a tree in that holy city. And when you see it, you'll remember we've been restored. We've been on this long, ugly journey. And God, through His Son, has restored us. Jesus is the designated, acceptable substitute of the highest quality. So I'll now ask, would He do this for me? You see, in all this world that people strive for fairness, inclusiveness, and sameness, we don't have equal revelations of God. Nor will we on this earth. We have not sinned equally. But we are in equal need of His pardon. There we are equal. We stand equally guilty, and we have equal access to salvation. Let me be sarcastic for a moment. I know you'll be shocked. You see, I would expect that there's a type 1 salvation for the heathen, the barbarian, because they need a lot of grace. You can agree with me and it'll be all right. I see a type 2 salvation for good moral people who need some grace, but boy, they've really got it going on. They've got a good moral, life happening. And then there's a type 3 salvation for the really religious folks who just need a little tiny bit of grace to kind of push them over the top. No distinction is made from rich or poor, between race or skin color, between male or female. There is one type of salvation, and it is a one-size-fits-all variety. It doesn't say anything about how bad you've been, how much you need this, how much grace you're going to need to soak up. It's and here's what I'm reduced to it sometimes when I'm around some folks that need a lot of shiny things to get excited about God. Why can we not get excited about plain old vanilla salvation? With no trinkets, with no shiny things, with no dress up, with nothing extra, just this plain one size fits all. Some might want to draw you into some kind of a discussion of who needs more forgiveness, who needs the comparison, I'll ask you. That's a waste of time. We all are equal. There's none of this. Well, he's a real bad sinner. I know you were a good sinner, right? You were one of those good sinners. This guy's a bad sinner. You know what I mean. He robs banks. He shoots people. There's a lot of violence in his family. He's a house painter by trade. Man, you know why he's an alcoholic. There's all kinds of drugs and self-abuse in his life. And the wild women, let me tell you the stories. But me, I was just late for class and threw spitballs in math class. That's all I did. Really? Verse 23 uses the phrase, the glory of God. This is a reflection of His nature. To fall short means to lack. Paul makes this point of falling short of the glory of God, because being clothed in His glory is His plan and intention for us. There's a first century Jewish writing entitled The Life of Adam and Eve, and they use this term referencing the glory of God that was in the garden, in their opinion and interpretation, that was used as their clothing and health protection. They were clothed 24/7 in the glory of God before the sin. You see, and I'll be technical for just a second, with the glory of God upon them, underneath the covers, they're still naked. But they didn't know it. They were not aware. They didn't have a consciousness of the lack until sin, and they lost their clothing of the glory of God, their protection, their health protection, their covering before God, and they knew they were naked. They were exposed to the elements. I think it's amazing. I grew up around wild animals. And there wasn't one report in my lifetime where a wild animal was diagnosed with death because of exposure. They have protection. They live in the cold. They have fur. They have reduced bodily functions. They hibernate. They don't die of exposure. If you and I go out there in the Siberian winter, you're dead. Why? You got no clothes. Even if you have clothes, they're not enough. You will die. Adam and Eve knew more, I believe, than they were naked. They were without protection of any kind. They were exposed. How did they fall short? Sin. It's just that simple three-letter word. Romans 3:23 has a comma at the end. Paul's thought that's being developed continues. Justification is explained here. Note that justification, justice, and righteousness all come from the same word in the original Greek. That's all the same word. It just depends on the setting and how it's translated. It's a gift and cannot be earned. It's entirely of the grace of God, and it comes through the redemption of Jesus Christ. That's amazing. We can now have the glory of God. Not in one of those special camp meeting services where for 15 minutes there's some kind of a cloud in the house and a wonderful manifestation, and it's great. I'm talking about 24/7 individually. Just as powerful as that demonstration that happened at camp meeting or wherever it was that you remember. Verses 25 and 26, the blood of Christ. Why did Jesus Christ die publicly? Why was such a brutal price necessary in the substitution price paid for my sin? To demonstrate the righteousness of God, that He is fair, that He means He will not make an exception for me. Some of my Christian friends have a Catholic background, and I hear them praying for special dispensation. God, we need a little extra thing in this situation. You know, it's me. It's me that's calling, and I need a little extra in this deal. God can't give you a little extra. Did you know that? He loves us all the same, and He loves us to the absolute ultimate. He has given you everything, and you want a little extra? The universe falls apart if He treats you different or differently. He can't give you an exception, nor should He. Plain vanilla salvation is still pretty good. Oh, but I feel my need is extra. Well, that may be true. You may sense your need, and He's going, boy, hey, she woke up. You know, she gets the gravity of the seriousness of this situation. God takes sin very seriously. He takes the wickedness of sin very seriously. He takes the sin devastating effect upon people's lives seriously. Without the intervention of God in our life and the application by faith of that, we're going to live as damaged people. We may be redeemed, but there are some things that are deep, deep, deep injuries and bruising. He also takes very seriously how far He will go to effectively deal with sin. How far will He go to deal with that? What price will God pay to fix our lives and the damage of sin that has been to us? 2 Corinthians 5:21 says, God made Jesus, who had no sin, to be sin for us, so that in him we might be made the righteousness of God in him. That's how far God will go. That's how much he will pay. That's how much it takes to effectively deal with the ravages of sin. It's not just a rule being broken. We sin against God. We damage our relationship. We sin against ourselves, and we are hurt. And we damage others around us, our family and our friends, and all those relationships. This is massive for what we'd call one little thing. It's not little. Paul mentions now the law of faith in verses 27 through 31. This is not a law to follow that you can be proud of. You see, it's a humble route, for it specifically prevents us from gaining any credit of our salvation or good deeds, good motives, even though we trust, we believe, and we exercise our faith. Don't you dare take any credit. Here would be an illustration. You're drowning in the ocean, and there's only one lifeguard, both qualified and willing, to swim out to where you are beyond the breakers and save your sorry carcass. And he did. How much pride in your heart would it take for you to say, I have decided to accept the help of this lifeguard? Do you see what good judgment I must possess? Don't you think I've made a most intelligent choice of who I allowed to rescue me when there's only one available and willing? No, we'd be humbled to know that not only a stranger, but it is someone we considered to be our enemy previously, who gave up his life for us that we would be able to live. Our response would be, no, sir, we want to say thank you, but it just seems so inadequate in light of what you've done for me. For my family. I truly owe you my life. You've given me my life back. The first part of the book of Romans is dark and hopeless in its introduction, including the phrase in Romans 3:19, guilty before God. That's the bad news. However, there's a lot more that God wants to communicate to us, and here begins some of that good news. In 3:21, the wonderful word, but. There is a beacon of hope, a light shining in the darkness in a world filled with sinful men, and we now have righteousness posted to your account. In Romans 4:3 and 4:5, it's translated as counted. In Romans 4:4, 4:9, 4:10, 4:11, it's translated as reckoned. This is an accounting term. In Romans 4:6, 4:8, 4:22, 23, and 24, impute is the word that's used. All three words, counted, reckoned, and imputed, are all the same word in the original Greek, logizomai. The exact definition is this. It's a numerical calculation, an accounting term. The metaphorical definition is to put down or to post to your account. This has been posted to your account. You have an account with God. There is an entry. It is this word, righteousness, and it's now written on your personal, permanent record. Context for the righteousness of man. First, we know about self-righteousness. We always see the basis of pride and greed. But the context for the righteousness of God. Oh, you talk about a horse of a different color. Here is a characteristic of his nature and of his person. It is a provision by God for the salvation of mankind. Let's refresh justification for a moment. I know we spoke on it last hour. Statement by God in declaring a sinful man to be righteous and now acceptable in the light of his character that is now like God, based upon the substitutionary sacrifice of Jesus Christ and man's belief in him. That's the response that's necessary. The need of a flesh and blood example to illustrate justification, how it works, brings us back to the dramatic thrust of Romans chapter 4. This is taking a different approach to something we mentioned quickly earlier. The example he gives us here not only illustrates the justification that is so powerful, that's proof both to a Jew and a Gentile that we truly become emotionally overcome with its strength. For those that are coming out of Judaism, Paul could not use the example of a contemporary first century Gentile who has accepted Jesus Christ. That's not a good enough illustration. That might be acceptable for the Gentiles, but it's not acceptable for the Jew. The Jews view the Gentiles as the dirty, hungry little boy at the window of fine dining, and of course he wants in to share the goodness of God. Paul uses an example of a first century Jew who sees Jesus as the Messiah and believes unto salvation through him, and he would be termed a turncoat, a reprobate. So you can't use a first century Jew, you can't use a first century Gentile. A Gentile would be forced to convert to Jewish faith, to accept the Jewish Messiah from the Jewish scriptures. A Jew would only view such a man as a poor convert of Orthodox Judaism. So what do? Appeal for an apostate? Someone who's totally abandoned his religion and belief for Jesus of Nazareth? Paul's also dealing with those who are criticizing him, saying he has left behind the Old Testament truths and he's now begun to teach something that's altogether new in concept and in practice. And this newfangled belief that you received in the desert by revelation of the Holy Spirit has nothing to do with the accepted scriptures of our day. Paul needs a man standing in the Old Testament whose life will illustrate the salvation of God. Without using good works, without using their religion, no ceremonies, even their obedience to the law of Moses. You know where I'm going with this, don't you? Not only does he find someone who received God's blessing and favor outside of the law of Moses, he found a Gentile to boot. This is just amazing. However many runs you take at this and different perspectives, it's just awesome that God brought all of that training into Saul of Tarsus' life. You see, he doesn't have to look stuff up. He knows it. He knows it well. He knows it as well as anyone alive. Maybe anyone who has ever been alive. There's that possibility. So in chapter 4 of Romans, the first 15 verses are dealing about works, religious ceremony, and the law of Moses. What about works? In verses 1 through 8, we all go all the way back to Genesis 15:6, and he believed in the Lord, and he counted it to him for righteousness. Should I deal with the pronouns here? And he, Abraham, believed in the Lord, and he, the Lord, counted it to him, Abraham, for righteousness. Not by religious rite or ritual. The circumcision of Abraham came after he had received God's righteousness. The circumcision was only a sign of the covenant being active. It wasn't the covenant itself. And you could have the sign of the covenant without having the covenant. Oh boy, and there's a loophole that whole groups of people have jumped through. They have the symbol. They have the sign of the covenant, but they don't have the covenant. Not by law. This is verses 13 through 15. The promise of the covenant is to Abraham and his descendants and comes by faith. It is not the genetic offspring of Abraham. It's the faith offspring. And Paul has clearly gone through that process in the book of Galatians, that we become the children, the first generation children of Abraham because of our faith in God, like Abraham had faith in God. My faith is like the faith of Abraham. In verse 17, the characteristics of Abraham's faith are these. There is a chosen focus, and that is our eyes are on God and not on the impossibility of the problem. Because if you laid that out as an assignment, it's a problem. How are you going to find somebody? How do you come up with this? We look at him as the God of life. Abraham believes that God can raise the dead. Now, maybe your first thought is going to the son, Isaac. But there's indications here it's going to the seed, singular, seed, singular. Who is that seed? It's Jesus. Jesus is the singular seed, reference to Abraham, always, always, always. He could raise him from the dead. Of course he can raise Isaac. Of course he can raise Isaac. Not a problem. Also, the third thing is he is the God of miracles. Abraham believes, and I'm including you in the offspring as men and women of faith today. Abraham believes God can and will bring into being that which does not now exist. And so do you. And we identify with the man Abraham, with his faith, with his activities, but now by the particular characteristics at the detail level. You know, God sometimes speaks of future events in past tense, because in his book, they're done. They're done. Let's go on to the next page. Oh, you're talking about that? Well, it hasn't happened yet. Yeah, but it will. That one is put to bed. We just are lacking the manifestation. And that's a good separation for us to see today. God gives us a word, and it resonates. It finds a place in our heart where there's good soil. And sometimes we choose to doubt because we haven't seen the manifestation. It takes time. So, well, I'm ready. What's he waiting on? Well, there are other people that he has to put in position. You know, we've got to change the heart of Pharaoh. We have to change the heart of King Artaxerxes to give favor to Nehemiah. Nehemiah is in the blocks on the track waiting for the gun to sound, and Artaxerxes is not there yet. And God works his heart. Nehemiah, stay ready, because I'm coming. I'm not trying to be slow, but there are other people involved here that we have to bring up, for example. The promise to Joshua in chapter 5 is another wonderful example. You see, as a gift, this was the night before the march, or what the song calls the battle. There wasn't much battle to it, was there? But the night before the event, God says, I'm going to give you a gift, and that is the victory over the city. of Jericho. I'm giving it to you now. You have it. Now, go watch the manifestation. Go out and see the goodness of our God coming upon us. You've got it in your heart. It's in my book. It's written. The book is closed. Brother, it's yours. Now begin to live in accordance with that expectant manifestation. Romans 4:18 says, in hope against hope, he believed. That's from the New American Standard Bible, and it's a very interesting phrase, the way they have brought that about. In hope against hope, he believed. Is that confusing to anybody? On one hand, there's hope. Hope that Abraham would be the father of many nations by Isaac, just as God had promised. He's got that one filed away in permanent category, don't you know? But hope, on the other hand, in the character and the nature and the judgment of God, who said to him, sacrifice to me your only son, the one you love, the son of promise, the son of laughter, give Isaac to me. That's a different kind of hope. That's a different hope. Now we're hoping in the character of God to be a God of his word. Wait a minute. You want me to kill the seed of many nations? The human brain is amazing, isn't it? The miracle son that I now have, she is still infertile, I am still impotent, and we are not going to be able to have any more children. You mean that one? The son for whom can be no replacement? Oh, but you'll have other sons. No, I don't think so. Is this the son you want? What do I do in my life when faced with a hope that seems to be contradictory? Then, as children of faith of Abraham, we do exactly what Abraham did, and we trust and believe in him. And I'll reread this New American Standard phrase from 4:18. In hope against hope, he believed. There's 3 parts in there. And you understand and you've experienced that very thing. Not exactly the way Abraham and Isaac did, but you've had hope against hope. How can this happen? God, you've blessed me with this money for this purpose, and now you're telling me to give that money somewhere else, and this need still exists. And are you sure? Are you sure? Verse 20 says, 14 years of waiting made the faith of Abraham strong. Well, that hasn't been my experience, Mark. Over the course of 14 years, my faith gets weak. Well, let me give you an example from your own life. Each one of you here tonight believe that Jesus Christ is coming to this earth, physically, bodily, and every eye shall see, and every knee shall bow, and every tongue will confess. You believe that? He's coming. He's really coming. But he didn't come today. Does your faith in that fact diminish? Not at all. In fact, when you flip this over this way and say, look, we are closer to the second coming by one more day than any person has ever been in the history of the earth. No one has lived closer. There come the bumps. Goose has got nothing to do with it. We are living closer than any person has ever lived to the second coming. Can your faith grow stronger over the years? Absolutely. Absolutely. How? Keep looking unto him, the author and finisher. Here's a phrase that if you've read it here, you've never read it anywhere else. Abraham staggered not at the bump on the head, at the brass knuckles that he got hit with, by the 2x4 over the back of his head. No. He staggered not at the promise. At the promise. The promise is something good. But think of this. This promise is so good that it might take you off your feet. It's that good. So this is not a bad thing coming up. How big is your God? Is he bigger than your problem? Is he bigger than your situation? Is he bigger than the impossible? You know, when things are doable, he assigns them to you or to me. And when they're impossible, he smiles and rolls up his sleeves and says, watch this. And he does what cannot be done. He does what cannot be done. If your problems, situation, and your impossibilities are bigger than the God that you have, I'm just going to try to be polite and say you need to trade your small God in for a bigger one. I try to do this about every 5 years. Looking in the mirror, Mark, your God's too small. You need a bigger God than you thought you did. You need to let him be the mighty God of creation, the one who can speak into existence things that are not. Speaking light into existence is no small parlor trick. What do you work with? Well, you know, watch this hand while I make light with this other hand. No, that's not going to happen. Speaking into existence, because the elements must obey him, and they must continue to obey him until he tells them to stop. And I'm jealous of that on a personal basis. I seem to need cheerleaders. I seem to need exhorters. I seem to need encouragers. I seem to need things to continue to trust God. And light just keeps shining because it's been told to shine. How can I believe in such a great God? Well, simply by having the exact same faith as did Abraham. And I don't know if this little acrostic is on your page or on your slide or not. Faith. Is that on there? Good. Forsaking all, I trust him. It's a wonderful little acrostic. It doesn't work in Swahili. It just works in English, but I'm just going to take it for what it is. A review of chapter 4 of Romans, introduction. The favorite hymn of many people is the old hymn, Amazing Grace. Probably the most often sung or played hymn ever. And yet we find that many of the same people are quite hostile to the concept of grace being a gift. It's a very common view both in the Jewish world and the Christian world that somehow we must demonstrate righteousness to gain the approval of God. And that's certainly not true. They prefer this approach. We get our salvation the old-fashioned way. We earn it. Wow. Justification, a right standing before God, is a result of faith and not just some new concept that Paul drags in here, but it can be seen clearly in the Old Testament.
Yes.
Paul makes one point in Romans chapter 1 through 3. Each man is in need due to every person having disobeyed the revelation of God to them. Their need is justification, but justification is not from works, chapter 4, 1 through 8. Not from religion or observances, 9 through 12, It's not from the law of Moses or the obedience to any set of rules, 13 through 15. For Abraham did not obey the law of Moses. There's only 400 years separating those men, and it would have been absolutely impossible for Abraham to obey the law of Moses. And yet he was given the promise, and the law came 420 years later. Justification is available to all men, but it's not exclusive to any special group or subset. Verse 16 says, all justification comes as a result of faith. Of faith. The good news in verse 24, God will accept us by faith just as he accepted the faith of Abraham. And 25, we receive justification through the sacrificial work of Jesus Christ on the cross of Calvary. Kent Hughes writes in his book, Righteousness from Heaven, for once hopelessly lost sinners who received through faith the righteousness of God and now stand justified before him, the true believer was once under wrath, but then was saved by faith, and now he exults with great joy. For Christian believers that are not yet joyful, you don't understand what has happened to you. You just haven't opened the box. You haven't opened your mind. There's a personal passage here, both for Paul and for us. Allow your joy to be contagious. Touched by these verses on the benefits of justification. And he begins verse 5, and we'll just look at this very briefly. Therefore, we have peace with God. After all this, therefore, is connective tissue. It is a summary term. It's a gathering term. Therefore, as a result, here we have the transition from the 4 chapters presented to this important doctrinal presentation that's about to come. The term we has frequent usage here that includes you. This is written by a former devout Orthodox Jew who has converted to Christianity, now writing to Italian Gentiles who probably had a pagan background. The Jews look down on Italians? Wait, these aren't Jews and Italians. These are Christians. These are Christians. Knock that other stuff off. I took a DNA test. You know what I found? God is my Father. Drop these divisive terms.
Yes.
Drop them. Don't identify with your history, your group, your country. Drop them. We're Christians. It's a new culture. It's a new citizenship. It's a new family. It's a new DNA. Ditch the old stuff. Ditch it. I know the Pope is in Canada apologizing for genocide of culture to the indigenous peoples right now, this minute. Apologizing. Why? Because missionaries introduced Jesus as the only way to salvation and messed up their culture. Well, there's nothing in my culture that I want to retain, let me tell you. None of it is beneficial. None, except to build up my ego, my better than thou attitude. Verse 1 says peace with God. We're brought into acceptance with God, a position that is of immediate possession, not a feeling, not an emotion. Philippians 4 speaks of the peace of God. We rejoice, we are jubilant, we are shouting about it. What about Eastern religions? They offer an endless nightmare of reincarnation. Existentialists think the concept of the future is absurd. Evolutionists offer us no comfort at all. None. Christians, they rejoice in the hope of the glory of God. verse 2 in chapter 5. Watch now for the first element that can produce and is connected to the next. Tribulation produces patience or perseverance, the ability to abide or to live under pressure. I know a little bit about your lives. You're under some pressure. Different kinds, different amounts, different times. Sometimes during the day, sometimes at night. But you're under pressure. There's a patience that's going to be produced as you continue. Tribulation can result in bitterness and failure to trust God, or with that trust that God expects from us, an endurance is gained. Patience then produces experience, a test of possessing sterling character, and it's proof. Proof becomes experience that produces hope. Why? Because God has seen us through one more time again, just like we knew He would. He hasn't brought us this far to dump us in the desert. He has not brought us this far without a purpose, a plan, the provision, and the protection. This hope, and here Paul uses this famous double negative for a very real purpose, causes us to be not ashamed. So he doesn't want to use the word proud for all the wrong reasons, but not ashamed. We're not ashamed. Are you kidding? Remember chapter 1, not ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ that transforms a person into something brand new. Not ashamed of the gospel. I'm shocked he's not ashamed of me. The fruit of the process: tribulation, patience, experience, hope. Let me dash through these 3 verses quickly and I'll close. Romans 5:1, peace with God. Verse 2, access to this grace in which we stand. Access is literally an introduction, gaining an audience with the king, or to put it in legal terms, a friend of the court. You go in with an overwhelming influence factor. And then we come to verse 2, rejoicing in the hope of the glory of God. And verse 3 says, rejoicing in tribulation. Rejoicing in tribulation. Why? Because we know what it produces in its chain cycle. We know that that's the first step. And things are going to turn better and better and better. Hang on. Hang on. God is forming something amazing, miraculous, astounding. He's going to make you look like a genius to your neighbors and to your family. Because of what develops in your life, because of your priorities and your dedication, and how God is going to manifest Himself through you. And so, by verse 3, you're going to rejoice in tribulation. You can just go ahead and start now. You don't have to wait. You don't have to wait till the process unfolds. You can just go ahead now because you know what's coming. And you know God is faithful and that He will protect His name and His provision in your life to the end.
Thank you for watching Studies of the Christian Faith. This program has been produced by A Life Devoted to Ministry, LTD Production, and is home of Training Trainers to Lead, a part of the International School of Missions and Evangelism. We hope you enjoyed watching this program. For more information or to support our ministry, please visit ldtms.org.